All right, welcome back. Today, we're going to dig into some really fascinating research, stuff that might just challenge how you think about the very nature of stereotypes.
Okay, so let's just jump right in with a big question. One that, well, it probably feels like it has a super obvious answer, right? For as long as we can remember, we've been told that stereotypes are just illogical. They're the product of a biased, irrational mind.
And you know, this isn't a new idea. This is the classic definition, going all the way back to Walter Lippmann in 1922. He basically said they're factually wrong, illogical, and rigid. And that's pretty much been the foundation for how we've thought about them ever since, just flawed mental shortcuts.
But what if that's not the whole story? What if there's more to it? Some recent research is asking a really surprising question. Now, to be clear, it's not asking if the content of a stereotype is true or false. Instead, it's asking, what if the process itself, the way our brain actually does the stereotyping, follows a logical, even mathematical rule?
And this whole idea revolves around something called Bayes' theorem. It sounds complicated, but the core idea is pretty simple. It's basically a mathematical rule for updating your beliefs. You know, when you get new information, Bayes' theorem gives you a logical way to adjust how confident you are in what you thought before. It's all about learning from experience.
So that brings us to the key question these researchers, Prachi Solanki and Joseph Cesario, wanted to answer. They asked, does our brain use something like this rule when we make snap judgments about people? I mean, could the actual mental machinery behind stereotyping be Bayesian? It's a wild thought.
So how do you even test that? Well, they came up with this really clever experiment. They basically break down a stereotype by asking you 4 specific questions. So question 1 is your direct guess, your gut feeling. Something like, hey, what percentage of Germans are industrious? Then the other 3 questions are designed to get at the individual beliefs that Bayes' theorem would need to calculate an answer to that same question.
And here's where it gets really cool. They take 2 things and put them side by side. First, there's your direct answer to question 1, your intuitive guess. They call that the judged probability. Then, they take your answers to the other 3 questions, plug them into Bayes' formula, and get a calculated probability. So the big test is, how close are these 2 numbers? Does your gut feeling match the math?
And the result? It was pretty stunning, actually. They found an incredibly strong correlation, a 0.80. Now, for those of you who work with stats, you know that in this kind of social science research, finding a correlation that high is, well, it's a really big deal. We're talking across 3 different studies with more than 2,600 people.
So what does this actually mean? It suggests that people's intuitive judgments, their gut feelings, were remarkably consistent with the predictions of this rational mathematical rule. It means the process of how our brains combine these beliefs isn't random or haphazard. It seems to be following a very logical pattern. Okay, so that's one piece of the puzzle. But it leads to another question, right? If the process is logical, then what makes a certain trait stereotypical in the first place? Why do we associate some traits with some groups and not others? What makes it feel like it fits?
Well, to figure this out, the researchers used a tool called the diagnostic ratio. You can just think of it as a score for how useful a trait is for telling groups apart. It basically measures how much a trait helps you distinguish one group from just, people in general. And the way it works is super simple. If the score, the ratio, is greater than 1, it means the trait is diagnostic. It's more likely for that group than for people in general, so it helps you tell them apart. But if the score is less than 1, the trait isn't very distinctive at all.
And when they looked at the data, the pattern was crystal clear. The traits that people labeled as stereotypical had these high diagnostic ratios, an average of 1.20. And the traits they said were non-stereotypical, yep, those had low ratios, averaging around 0.77. So it really looks like we build our stereotypes out of traits we think make a group stand out.
Okay, all of this is leading up to what is probably the single most important point of this entire analysis. And it is absolutely critical that we get this distinction right, because it's at the heart of what this research actually means and what it doesn't mean.
And here it is. This is all about the process, not the content. Let me say that again. The research suggests that the way we think, our cognitive machinery, can follow logical, rational rules. But, and this is a huge but, that says absolutely nothing about the information we're feeding into that machine. The what we think, the actual beliefs, can be totally inaccurate, unfair, or harmful. You can have a perfectly logical process that still produces a terrible result if you start with bad data.
So let's just wrap up the key takeaways here. First, the cognitive process of stereotyping can be rational. But
And this is the most important part. That does not mean the content of any stereotype is accurate or okay. It's just a model of how our brains seem to make these social predictions. The research itself takes no position on whether any specific stereotype is true.
And that leaves us with a final, pretty provocative thought to chew on. If the way we stereotype is logical, what does that mean for changing what we believe? It kind of suggests that if the mental engine is running logically, then maybe the problem isn't a broken engine. Maybe the real challenge is being much more careful about the fuel, the information we put into it in the first place.